From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 23. Fraenk was not now, nor would he ever be that interested in the nautical trade. He made sure he knew enough to do his job, but the fact that Blackroot District was central to the primary port in Arathes was merely another detail in the many things he might need to concern himself with on any given day. Boats, ships, barges, and really anything to do with the traversal of aquatic byways were best left in the very capable hands of Fenduin Talofront, their experienced, if eccentric, Acheron of ports and harbours. Talofront had sailed the entire world in his youth before ending up in Arathes and pledging his service to Blackroot. And for what he lacked in social decorum, he more than made up for with his talent in mathematics and obsession with the transport of cargo. Lady Blackroot's trust in the elf's abilities to manage the port was near total, for he also seemed to lack the instincts for any kind of graft or duplicity. Fraenk regularly crossed paths with the Acheron while he was dealing with thieves and smugglers or in their district meetings with her lady, where Talofront never failed to bemoan about the massive deadbeat Pyleusian galleon which remained perpetually squatting in their dry dock, costing them gold. Of all the elves Fraenk knew, Talofront exemplified their high-minded ideals better than most. When he arrived at the busy port, Fraenk felt an instant sense of being out of place. Part of it had to do with the fact he was mounted on the huge bitey destrier, Jimothy, who drew startled glances and stares as they clomped past. Fraenk watched as the port moved like a buzzing beehive. Workers were busy loading and unloading cargo from the tall three-masted ships that arrived in the night, using enormous cranes that had counterweights to balance out the loads. Smaller vessels carrying passengers, trade goods, or livestock disembarked right on the harbour-side road, where they could easily transport their wares up to the market, and also in a place where they wouldn't get in the way of the bigger cargo. Further beyond that, the night fishermen were hauling in their catch into the cleaning houses, where workers cleaned and gutted the fish, packed them in ice, and loaded them into carts going to every part of the city. Horse-drawn carts rumbled by with full loads. Gawking tourists stopped to marvel skyward at the gleaming upper city looking down from the heights. White and grey seabirds who were not filling themselves on fish guts from the cleaning houses circled and called overhead in lazy circuits of the blue sky, looking for an opportunistic meal from an unguarded basket. A wind was blowing in off the lake, making the morning air almost chilly. They were temporarily delayed when Jimothy found an open crate of apples and began to help himself. Fraenk jerked at the reins, but the destrier only swivelled its massive head and fixed him with a glossy black-eyed glare, warning him not to do that again, or there would be consequences. Acquiescing, Fraenk released his grip and moved as far back in the saddle as he could. The horse held his ground against a whole squad of dock workers, driving them back with bites and kicks. Only after he had eaten nearly the entire box did he discharge a steaming pile of turds on the dock boards, then allowed himself to be led away. Fraenk offered to reimburse the workers, but only if they shipped the nasty horse off to be fed to the Kraken of Caladel. For some reason, none of the men took him up on it. With any luck, Fraenk could get to the tower, find the kobold, and make the trade before that sadist Farathiel killed his men. He was already crafting some kind of retribution for the rival Arch-Preceptor's actions. It was one thing to use manipulation and extortion to achieve your district's goals, but kidnapping and killing their preceptors was a whole different story. "You're already at war," Mycon's voice told him in his mind, "and if you have to fight, then win." Whether it was the crisp wind off the lake, the plaintive cries of the gulls, or just remembering his old friend's voice, a wave of grief hit Fraenk unexpectedly. His eyes welled with tears. Fraenk was tired, hungry, and aching in more places than he could count, and everything was dumping out of him at the same time. "I'm trying, Mycon. "I won't let you down," Fraenk said to the air. Perhaps the wind would carry his message on to his friend, wherever he may be. As Fraenk moved down the docks, something odd began to happen. A kind of collective lull rippled through the area. The people who were working slowed and stopped what they were doing, then turned to look off in the distance, their gaze all fixed on the same thing. Something was happening at the lighthouse. From his high horseback vantage, Fraenk could see above the heads of the gathered crowd that, sure enough, a force of grey-suited men were running out on the jetty and forming up around the lighthouse. They were followed by several others on horseback. It was the partisans. "Hells," Fraenk snarled and dug his heels into the horse's sides. Jimothy seemed to sense aggression and shot forward, clopping so loudly on the wooden dock planks, Fraenk began to worry they'd go crashing through. People who saw him coming jumped out of the way to keep from being smashed aside by the snorting beast. Along the way, they startled a stalk-eyed bat creature which had been feasting on a gull carcass. An instant later, Jimothy's hoof dashed it into a spray of black viscera. Oh, the chaos bat. Right. Fraenk recalled with a shrug. That was one less thing to worry about. In less than a minute, they were riding out onto the jetty and up to where arch-partisan Olwyn Brightrock and two of his vice-arch-partisans were surveying the area. "What is going on here?" Fraenk asked, as he reined up the huge destrier before it flattened a squad of partisans. The two other elves beside the arch-partisan shot Fraenk a scathing look, but Brightrock put up a hand before they could speak.
"See to this. I'll have a word with Neversleep, since this is his district."
The arch-partisan commanded his underlings. He turned and nudged his horse up alongside Frank's. It looked like a pony in comparison. "What is this?"
"We got word of 2 dangerous fugitives hiding out here. One was just spotted heading inside. We're here to arrest them."
Brightrock said plainly.
"Do we have your permission for that?" "Yes, good, thank you, Neversleep."
"Hold on a tick. The guy I'm looking for is in there," Fraenk growled. "So who tipped you off to this?"
"The bounty hunter. That's him right there."
Fraenk followed Olin Brightrock's nod behind him. Coming down the jetty between the 2 pudgy arcane lords Fraenk had met after the Blackhound incident was the hell-touched man with the emerald gem collar. Fraenk snapped around so hard he almost fell out of his saddle. "That one?" Fraenk exclaimed. The hell-touched man seemed to innately sense that Fraenk was watching, and he looked up to match the stare with his own orange eyes.
"Saurzon Brimblade. He said his name was. A rather eccentric sobriquet, if you ask me."
"He's no hunter. He's a foul wizard or something. They should be clapping him in irons," Fraenk said vehemently.
"And just how do you know that, Neversleep?"
Brightrock arched an eyebrow. "Well, it's my job to know, isn't it?" Brightrock either smirked or made the same face he always did with the ruinous scar at the side of his mouth. It was really hard to tell the difference.
"The story he told us is that he's working for the Fernbrooks to find their missing kobold servant. The little scriff lit off with some kind of family treasure. He tracked his accomplice here and is pretty sure they're both inside."
Frank's mind was racing. How could one man have such foul luck? He almost had the kobold in hand and now everything was falling apart. He cursed himself for not thinking that the Fernbrooks would certainly find other means to getting the kobold back. Everything was happening too fast. There was nothing he could do now but watch. "The arcane lords are here. We're ready to go in, sir," the shorter partisan lieutenant announced. Fraenk and Olwyn turned their horses to face the lighthouse. The 2 arcane lords had a debate amongst themselves over who would take the lead, which was ultimately decided by a quick round of the children's hand gesture game Wizard, Soldier, Dragon. The winner and the one with the honour of leading the operation fell to Stanris and his oily black ponytail. Stanris strode forward among the lean and athletic partisans, looking about as out of place as Acadian griffins scat on the white sands of the Monarch's Beach. He stepped in front and made wide, dramatic movements with his hands, while bellowing in an affected tone the words of his powerful spell. The wizard's melodrama only made Fraenk more annoyed. This whole scene with the arch-partisan and a full battalion of his men standing ready to capture a kobold and whoever his accomplice was. It stank of a mockery of puppet theatre, a very loud and public show to capture a supposed dangerous criminal. Fraenk stole a glance at the arch-partisan. His steely eyes were fixed on the tower. Was this his idea, or were his strings being pulled by another from the shadows? Then a loud crack and fizzle sent a brilliant shower of sparks skyward, and a blast of hot air back through the ranks. When the dust cleared, Stanris was seated flat on his backside, and the effects of his spell were still trailing off his hands. "By the powers!" he exclaimed in a high-pitched whine. He rose with some difficulty, trying to not appear injured and only looking doubly so. The other arcane lord, Timulot, was already pushing through the lines of partisans to join his colleague. "Stan, that didn't work. I know that, Tim." Fraenk caught just a snippet of the angry wizards bickering before it was carried off in the breeze. They proceeded to argue and gesticulate for longer than Brightrock had the patience for.
"My lords, just try again,"
he said through gritted teeth. Stanris repeated his spell, drawing it out longer and punctuating each move with a sharp staccato rhythm. The energy of the spell swirled in around him, and he shot his hands forward, siding the powerful spell toward the lighthouse door. Boom! A sound like thunder buffeted everyone there. Stanris had planted his feet this time, so he wasn't thrown to the ground, but the shockwave did slide him back a foot. Fraenk watched the sparks rise into the sky again, up, almost to where a small black dot was soaring above them. The lighthouse door was undamaged.
"Is there a problem?"
Arch-partisan Brightrock called out, annoyance in his tone. "It's protected by some kind of spell," the arcane lord called back. For what he lacked in proficiency of magic, Stanris did display a complete mastery of the obvious.
"Well, then I suggest you keep trying until you're in."
Brightrock smiled, or possibly sneered. Again, it was so hard to be sure. Then uttered a low
"Skarking morons"
that only Fraenk could hear. Fraenk couldn't help himself by wondering why all this trouble for just one kobold. He wasn't some wanted fugitive or escaped bandit king. His name wasn't written on wanted posters across the city. Pozu was just some filthy pet that they taught to carry a tray and light a pipe. Surely the expense and headache of all this far outweighed anything that Lord Fernbrook paid for him, even if he was specially trained and imported from faraway lands. What in Galhadria could possibly be worth all this? "Sir, did you say the kobold stole something? A valuable of some sort?" "That's what all this is about," Fraenk asked.
"That's what I'm told."
Brightrock replied, still watching as both arcane lords again prepared the spell together. "Seems a bit much if you ask me."
"You've got a more powerful spell up your sleeve, Neversleep. You want to take a crack at it?"
"No, sir, I'm talking about all of it. The bounty hunter full brigade of partisans, 2 arcane lords."
"I only wanted one, but the other insisted on joining."
Olwyn Brightrock growled. "It's still a lot of rah for just a single kobold fork swiper." Fraenk scratched his chin.
"I mean thieves. They're part of a larceny ring, ripping off wealthy elves and moving the goods out of the city. And these are the last 2.
"What exactly was stolen?" Fraenk pressed. His arch-preceptor instincts were telling him that whatever Brightrock knew was important. The sound of the spell forming was a low drone. Brightrock breathed in, about to say something, then stopped. "Sir, you have to tell me what they took. They might have hit us too. Lady Blackroot's been missing jewels," Fraenk said, just trying to keep the old elf talking, but then realised it was actually true. His second-in-command, Gwen, was posing as a servant girl, trying to track a thief. Could the light-fingered kobold have hit them as well? Seeing Fraenk as a victim and not just another preceptor hunting for information softened Olwyn Brightrock finally.
"They took valuables that powerful elves weren't too keen on reporting stolen. Cursed trinkets, a forbidden painting, some kind of fertility doll."
Fraenk's eyes went wide and he was hit by the shockwave. Not just the magical one cast by the 2 bumbling arcane lords, but an impact of realization on how the kobold fit in with the other murder victims. The stolen items matched everything that was stashed in the broker's house. That meant the kobold, the broker, the brothers, even Mycon. They were all a team of thieves. The arcane lords immediately began arguing with each other as to who bore more of the blame for their apparent failure. Brightrock growled, pinching the bridge of his nose.
"Did anyone just try the skarking door?"
he shouted, silencing both wizards. The arcane lords exchanged a glance as if to see which one of them would field such an inane question. Of course, someone tried the door. How stupid did he think they were? Then, a flicker of doubt. They did try the door, right? Stanris gave a derisive scoff and waddled over to it. He was just drawing a breath to vindicate himself when his thumb pressed the latch and the door lazily swung open. Brightrock's face turned 2 shades darker.
Don't just stand there.
Brightrock spat.
Go get him.
3 teams from the partisan battalion raced forward into the breach, clubs raised. Frank's mind was still reeling. Bass Greenbrier was looking for Fernbrook's kobold servant and found out Mycon was part of their ring of thieves. Maybe the old baker was hiding the kobold, buying him time so he could slip out the secret tunnel beneath the bakery. And that's why the woman... Another revelation hit Fraenk like a lightning bolt. The mysterious woman. The Lindblood. The first thing she had said when she found Fraenk in the bakery was, "Possou." She was looking for the kobold. He was supposed to meet her at the bakery that night. If Fraenk had any more surprises, he thought his head might explode. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but soon the elite partisan guards were coming back out of the lighthouse. 4 of them had slung between them the manacled figure of a woman. She had a black hood slipped over her head. She was sobbing, a wail of true anguish. The partisan in charge strode directly over to the 3 partisan commanders. "It's her, sir. Came without too much of a fight."
What about the other one? The kobold?
The guard paused. "He's dead. Looks like he has been for some time." "Dead?" Fraenk interjected. "What? How'd he die?" One of the vice-arch partisans started to say something to Fraenk, but Brightrock raised a hand for silence.
All right, Neversleep. We're done here. We'll be on our way.
Brightrock turned back to his man.
Take the woman to the cells and the kobold. Give him over to his kind so they can bury him or do whatever is their custom.
Actually, arch-partisan, that kobold belongs to Lord Fernbrook.
A familiar voice came from behind Fraenk. He turned to see Farathel Gingerglade, smiling viciously.
And our lord would very much like his property back.
Fraenk turned to glare at his nemesis.
Oh, and Fraenk, I no longer require your help in that other matter. Consider our deal dead.
Farathel smirked wickedly. Whether it was exhaustion, frustration, or the simple fact that he probably deserved it, Fraenk pulled the reins to turn the big white destrier toward Farathel. His mouth peeled back in a hateful sneer. "Jimothy, bite!" The horse's instincts were sharp, and so were its teeth. Gingerglade got an arm up just in time to keep Jimothy from taking a chunk out of his face, but he was lifted from the ground and thrashed in the air, screaming. Then all chaos erupted, as Fraenk laughed like a madman. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.